Greetings, everyone. Welcome. My name is Gary Rouchet, and together with Sarah Dehoff, we are co-faculty for the course Bringing Consultation to the Workplace, a course of the Wilmette Institute. And today we're going to be talking with Michael Burke, who is author of the book Moving Beyond Compromise, an interesting book, the subject of which is exactly the subject, I think, of the course. Is essentially talking about using Baha'i consultation in the workplace. And so, Michael, thank you very much for coming and spending some time with us. Perhaps you could start by telling us a little bit about yourself and your professional background.
Okay, Gary, thank you. I will do that. My background is pretty varied. I started in the pharmaceutical industry as a research scientist, and then moved up into several other positions: project management, in a specialized market research position, working with new products, and moved on from there to licensing and acquisitions. I spent 20 years at a company that is currently a part of the GlaxoSmithKline organization. And from there, I moved from North Carolina, where we were located, to back to Colorado, where I'd done my graduate work, and was running an immunology company, which I eventually sold. I moved on to a couple of other positions in the biotech industry, before finally looking around for something new. And I ended up starting a nanotechnology company. I worked with a friend to develop some software that we were trying to market into the home health industry. I worked with my wife to manage her personal physical therapy business, and ultimately went back and tried over the years to introduce this consultation idea into business, and found that I ran into a lot of resistance. My partners in writing the book, Kevin Smith and Gordon McComb, are in very different industries. Gordon is a software developer, and Kevin has done a number of things and currently is working with a company to expand their franchise base and location base and manage the construction projects for those. We've all tried to introduce consultation into these settings. We ran into resistance, a lot of resistance. Part of it has to do with with trying to get people to set their egos aside and listen to other information, and look at problems from the standpoint of solving the problem, not imposing their solution on it. Lots of resistance to that, and with some successes. We found that success came with working with small groups in which we had a way of helping to direct how the group was functioning. It worked well if you happened to be the chairman or the leader of a discussion group. You could ease people into this. What we found was that there was a lot of resistance if we tried to relate it to the Baha'i concept of consultation, which is very different, as we all know, from what people conceive of the word consultation and the concept of consultation in our society. What we found is if we related that to a religious background, that really was not very effective. People get very suspicious when you do that. But what we found in our small groups is we could help direct the process so that we could get all of those thoughts and ideas, and we could keep people's egos from interfering with listening to a certain extent. But I found working, especially in the pharmaceutical industry and the biotech industry, which I was a part of for actually 25 years, what I found with that is that they're so hierarchical that people have a hard time letting go of their management position to the point that they could actually listen to other people's ideas. And so that was very frustrating because we know how powerful this approach to decision making and problem solving can be. And so we got Kevin and Gordon and I were all part of the greater Metrobhai Baha'i community. Gordon and I lived in the suburb of Arvada. Kevin lives in the adjacent town of Westminster. And we were talking one day and talking about the frustration of getting people to actually listen to the concepts, much less apply them. And we decided to actually put this into an accessible format to business. Take out and get away from a word that's loaded. Consultation is a loaded term. People think they know what it means.
Yeah.
So we invented a title for it and called it solution building, which actually rings more bells in the business arena than consultation, because it says what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
And they're all about results.
Fantastic.
So we looked at that. It took us, I'll have to confess, it took us 9 years to write the book.
Nice.
We started 3 or 4 times, and we'd always find ourselves wandering off too abstractly.
Well, your book is about a fictional company that desperately needs to make decisions, good decisions. And the company is called JOG for short, and its CEO is Lily O'Hara, wife of the recently deceased J.J. O'Hara. Well, you chose this method to discuss consultation instead of providing guidelines and procedures and discussing it directly, as I understand it. And why did you do it that way? Because this was better way to communicate.
That was what we thought. We thought if we really want business to be applying this, we need to give a business context to the whole process of consultation. And so we thought about looking, first off, we thought about looking at a more judgmental approach, which was to go back and look at business decisions that clearly were bad and tear them apart and show how they could be better. And we said, no, that's not going to work because it's too hit and miss. There would be just too much. So we put it into a framework of a company in trouble, rather than trying to do a more sort of prospective approach. This is how you can. We decided to put it into this business geographics and look at why they got into trouble in the first place, and then take it to how they could maybe get out of that trouble. And so we looked at a number of things. We actually tried 3 or 4 different approaches before we hit on this, and then we looked at process and developed a series of guidelines ahead of time. Because businesses, even though we're told quite appropriately within the faith that we don't want to put rules on consultation, we know that businesses love rules. They love structure. And if you can present a structure that might look useful, then they're more likely to look at it. hard to know if they would actually engage, but they're more likely to look at it if they look at it as a process.
Uh-huh.
And so we developed, after a lot of discussion, we developed this set of 9, we call them guidelines or principles or whatever, rules in the book. And because rules people understand, guidelines, again, that's kind of a squishy term for business. So sometimes you have to put hard structure in place. Even though, as we know, we don't like that necessarily within the faith, but it does give an approach, a stepwise approach. And we looked at what we also spent a lot of time looking at what is it that interferes with getting a decision properly made. And we went back to all of our experiences. I had a lot of interactions in my position in the pharmaceutical industry. I was with a British-based company, the Wellcome Foundation, which ultimately, as I said, now belongs to SmithKline. And I had a lot of interactions with both our U.S. senior management and our main board in the U.K. in terms of decisions. And I watched how this happened. I watched one incident where 4 of us working together internationally put together a very complex licensing deal that would expand not only our an important product line, but also would give us an expanded technology for manufacturing that we actually needed for other products. And we put all this together. We spent a year working out licensing deals and contracts and putting together this arrangement that involved actually 4 outside parties.
Huh.
And technology from 2 or 3 universities as well. And so we put all this together, and we ended up taking it to our main board in London. And we were going through this, and I remember sitting there listening to our CEO. And he looked at me and said, when is this product going to be on the market? And having been a project manager for international drug development, I had a pretty good idea what that would entail. And so I told him. And he looked me in the eye and said, I'll be retired then. And I thought, well, we just wasted a year of our lives. And it turned out, because of his ego, we lost an opportunity that really a whole lot of people were behind. And so we looked at that incident right there, made me understand one of the things that is wrong with decision making is that people will look internally at their own positions and not care about a bigger issue, which is what's good for the organization.
Yeah.
And I saw this happen also at a number of other places, and people deferring to senior managers when they felt strongly those senior managers were wrong.
Yeah, I've seen that also.
Yeah.
Maybe Sarah, would you like to jump in? And do you have a question for him?
Well, I was wondering how the book was received. You've talked about the process of developing the ideas for the book and putting it into the story, and how did it play out once you presented the book to the people that you were reaching?
It was well received. I mean, people thought it was very well written, and this includes some people who actually think that they're part of the organization, the Society of Decision Professionals.
Okay.
Some of these people thought it was very good, but they had their own approaches.
Yeah. Always.
And so they thought, well, that's all very good, and we have and some people bought it. They gave us good reviews, but they did not. It hasn't really taken off yet. And one of the reasons, excuse me, one of the reasons that I started doing a bit more excuse me. It's real dry here in Colorado right now. One of the reasons that I started really reaching out through LinkedIn, which is how I think you found me, Sarah, and Facebook and others, is we're working with a young, well, relative to me, a young Baha'i woman in Westminster who actually works with authors to develop marketing plans. And so she's been working with us. And I started doing a blog about, I don't know, sometime middle of last year. On decision making, and talked a lot and went beyond the book in many ways, went into some of our sort of research that we did into how people think, and that's been ongoing. I'm still writing that because of all the circumstances around us right now. It's slowed down, but I've been looking at that, and people are starting now to see the book. We are looking at a relaunch of the book sometime, we hope fairly soon. But there's a couple of things. We wanted to add a section. In the book, we basically end with an appendix that lays out the guidelines, the rules. And what I'm working on now is, as part of a relaunch, is adding a second appendix of how do we implement those rules?
Yes. The plot in the book starts with some really unpleasant scenes, really, of people talking together. And then, of course, Lily, the new CEO, probably not very much respected by these people who knew her husband, didn't know her very well. She decides she's going to walk off to go to a cafe and sit down and think about things. And, of course, in this cafe, she finds, well, I can't remember his name, but a man, a stranger.
Steve, yeah.
And she goes over and talks to this stranger, and this stranger takes on a very big role in the book.
That's a really good question, because that particular part was one of the things that took us the longest to come up with, which was how, Lily, as a CEO, Lily in a company in trouble, Lily doesn't have time to go searching out how to do this or develop this on her own. And we know that there are plenty, we know this method, and we thought, well, let's just have someone that she randomly meets introduce this to her, this approach. And clearly this guy, Steve, in our mind, was, of course, a Baha'i, who uses consultation. We don't make that plain at all. In fact, the only place we mention the faith is in the introduction, because we wanted to be transparent that this actually comes out of something that is larger than the three of us. And so we thought, well, what if she somehow meets somebody, a consultant or something, who can help her with this process? And that's how Steve got created.
Well, I think it's really good. And okay, and when I read this, I see so many things that I experience in my professional life. I also use consultation in groups and in various ways in different parts of the world where I've worked and lived. But the some of the scenes in there struck me as, oh, that seems very familiar to me. And so, especially in the way people didn't talk well together. In fact, I'm even thinking I should read it's a kind of a small paragraph from the book that when I see this, I think, well, okay, that sounds a lot like today in a culture in which we live in today, but how do we make things change? And so let me read it for you real quickly. Different personalities, diverse interactions, company politics, and even social, political, and economic philosophies present barriers to agreement. Add to that the basic competitive nature of human beings, and the result can be a bubbling stew pot of rancor, foxhole digging, foot dragging, backbiting, criticism, individual conflict, and an attitude of I win, you lose, zero-sum game that leads to, at best, non-optimal decisions, and at worst, paralysis and no decisions at all. The case, maybe we have that kind of a situation and why people don't react too much to this new concept of consultation. The question is, how do we work to change this paradigm?
Right, and that really was the question. When we had chosen a company in trouble, we realized and talked about the fact that there are two ways to introduce this into an organization. One of them is to just bring it into your part, your group, and use this as a method for making decisions and demonstrate that the decisions that end up being made are better, whatever that means, are better decisions or more reasonable decisions than people have been seeing. This is a time-consuming process. It's a bottom-up process. Bottom-up is the best way to introduce anything, as we all know. However, when we are looking at a company that's in trouble, they don't have time for bottom-up. They had to impose it from the top. And so as a plot device, that was one of the reasons we chose to have a company in trouble, was a plot device where we could see how the CEO came to the conclusion that this was something she wanted to do with her company. And we very carefully chose the characters based on our own experience. And many of those, the statements that and arguments that people have are almost direct quotes out of our business experience. And I'm sure you know, as you said, Gary, you've probably seen all this. Sarah, you have too. And all of these things are people that are situations that people can readily recognize, which was another reason we wanted to do that. Let's have someone sit there and say, yeah, I know that situation. I know that person.
Yeah.
And tried to really put a human face on them as well. It was sort of like the character of the chief financial officer, Donna, in the book, came across as this hard-nosed, business person who used to do carpentry with her father. I mean, put a human face on many of them. But we looked at that, but really, if you look at the major issue of consultation, the major thing about consultation is the removal of the barriers that come from ego.
Super. Yeah, and in your plot, I like plots. I don't write much, but I do write a little bit. I'd like to make videos, but you, of course, had the villains in the plot, and that was what you called in the book the triplets, who came in and they didn't like anything, they knew everything, and very much ego-dominated. Sarah, over to you.
Yes. So in using these ideas in this story, have you seen effects in businesses that you've talked to? Or are you seeing people starting to adopt these ideas and using them in their businesses?
We are more, and Kevin, actually, my other author, has been seeing this to a greater extent because he's active in a very direct way with his company. I'm semi-retired. I now teach part-time. And so I actually use I actually try to bring this approach into various faculty meetings, and I find that university faculty certainly doesn't lack the ego issue, but they also understand the idea that we have to cooperate.
Yes.
And I find that they are a more amenable audience than when I was in the biotech industry and trying to get a bunch of highly egotistical individuals to actually listen to somebody else in the room. And so, but Kevin has actually had a lot more success introducing this into the company he's currently working with, which is a software security organization that is expanding its operations around the country. He actually brought that in, and his CEO is one of the people on the back cover of the book, Larry Jones.
Super.
And he liked it, and he's been more amenable. But the rate of recidivism in terms of attitude is incredible. When they get into a stressful situation, they fall back on the old ways instantly. And so Kevin has been both happy and frustrated with this. But it's a process. It will not be easy to get businesses to change because you're asking people to change. And getting people to change, as we all know, is frustrating, difficult, time-consuming. It will happen as they see the results.
Yeah,
I believe that firmly. But I've been working with the faculty at the school I teach with. I teach in an occupational school, and the students that I teach are the ones who become medical assistants and phlebotomists and so forth. It really is. I love the work and I love teaching them the skills, but I also try to teach them how to listen.
Yeah. What about the authoritarian aspect of Lily? She comes in as a boss, as the CEO. She has to be tough, actually, with her team. She actually has to move people from one position to another, even considering firing people. Is this going to be necessary when we begin to look at implementing consultation in different environments, in different companies, in different groups? Because some people just won't want to conform to the rules.
We will find that there are people who won't conform. And those are the people that that are letting their egos get into the way. That's why we had the situation with the director of research, and Lily had to be authoritarian. That's the nature of CEOs, at least currently. And what we were trying to do with that was to make it an unpleasant enough experience for even her that she didn't want to have to repeat it. I've been in the position as a CEO myself where I had to fire people. And I couldn't figure out how best to take my approach. My approach was always to look at people. It's one thing to fire someone who's stealing from the company. That's a no-brainer. But when someone simply doesn't fit in and doesn't want to, even though they're competent, they're good, they're smart, how do you dismiss them? My approach was always to go to them, sit down with them, just sit in their office, in their space with them, and say, look, this isn't working. I want you to find another place to work, and I want you to stay working with us while you're doing that, because that'll make it a lot easier for you to get your next position. But I want you to know that there's nothing wrong with your work. It's just you don't fit in the organization. And it's causing problems with everyone else in the organization. So you have 2 weeks, a month, whatever, and you're on the payroll, you're still working, find another position. And what I find is that what I've found, I've had to do this a couple of times, and what I've found is that those people don't need anywhere near the amount of time I give them, because they are good. and they're very happy with the way they're let go. And the other people in the organization who see this happening then also see, oh, there's a different way than walking in and saying you're fired. I've been on the you're fired end. I had a CEO one time who was a horrible manager. Couldn't, he was very high ego. I'm in charge. I have to show that I'm the boss. And he made the dumbest decisions. And he wouldn't listen to any of us. And so when something went wrong, he'd pick out a person to blame and fire them and say, oh, I fixed that. Well, ultimately, of course, his board got rid of him. But not until he fired me and 5 other people in senior positions, because it made him feel like he was making the right, he was solving problems. I looked at that and I said, I'm not going to be that guy. Mm-hmm. And how can we do this in a better way? So, and I looked at that and I thought, how can we introduce that method of getting rid of Jason to Lily? And we decided that was, if we were actually sitting there saying we have a problem and we need to survive right now, we couldn't do it that way. So Lily had to be an autocrat.
Yeah.
And what we did was make her not like that experience.
I can tell a quick story with the teams that I had. I would say, listen, we're going to make we're going to make a consensus decision in a consultative type way, and but I have the authority and the responsibility. Not you. The buck stops with me. I can't give it away, even if I wanted to. But the last thing I want to do is to override you. I want this to come to a good decision that we can then implement and go forward with. The last thing I want to do is get in the middle of that and have to override you because you're fighting amongst yourself or whatever the reason is, But ultimately, yeah, I'm sorry, but as the boss, it's my responsibility. I can't give it up. That's my job. And I think any CEO in any company is going to be in that position. And I think the attitude and the culture of the boss can have a big impact on whether or not that consultation can really go forward and learn in a learning process.
Well, ultimately, yes. You run into situations all the time where your group is either not able to make a decision or unwilling to come to a consensus. Obviously, consensus is the best way if the consensus is not, oh, we're going to do what the boss says. Mm-hmm. When there's, and that's the boss. I mean, you as the team leader had to set the tone that said you have the ability to influence this decision, whether I have the responsibility ultimately or not, and I'm going to listen to you. I mean, the tone from the top of any structure needs to set the stage for those decisions. And what we wanted to do was with Lily in this book was to show an evolution in her to moving forward. That's why we ended the book without saying what happened to the company. Because there's no way, we looked at that and said we could make this a success story, but that makes it a novel, not a which it is in some ways,
yeah.
not a tool for people to use without a guarantee. I mean, there's no guarantee of success anywhere in business, but we did that. But Lily had to face up to how do you get, when you have a group of people who are just flat refusing to participate in any way but their own, how do you change that situation? Well, obviously in many organizations, they'd just be fired. And we looked at that and we decided that we may have to do that with one person. We actually resisted that for quite a while. And tried to think of something else that would move things along. But we had set up this character of Jason to the point where he very clearly was not going to listen to anyone. And so we chose very carefully. Actually, the first personnel director was also a woman, and it was pointed out to us by one of our wives that here we are. We have two women firing one man. Do we really want to do that? So that's when the gender of the personnel director changed, because we didn't want to throw in a distractor.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And we wanted to, but it really was hard for us to figure out how to make Lily, who was learning about consultation, which is not something that would generally lead to immediately firing someone just because they weren't cooperating, but put it in a position where Lily showed that she was capable of doing this, and that's sort of a perhaps hammer-handed way of what you just said, Gary, which is I'm in charge, I'm the responsible person, and I am told I must make this decision, and I want it to be our decision, but there may be decisions that I have to make that won't be what everybody wants.
Yeah, it absolutely.
And so, so doing that, we then gave the other two of the triplets enough of their own understanding that they realized that perhaps they'd better cooperate or they might be fired. And that wasn't really what we wanted. That's not what we set it out to do. But we allowed them then to make themselves into less of caricature and more human.
The story is wonderful, and you've laid out and illustrated the dynamics that can happen in a business. I was curious about how your experience with the change that occurs when consultation is implemented, whether it's in the faculty groups that you're working with or other businesses. What changes have you observed as this approach is taken on?
One of the major changes that I have seen is the change that gets people to listen to each other. We have, as I say, even in a faculty, but working in the pharmaceutical and biotech industry, we have, the full range of personalities. We range everywhere from the people who never say anything to the people you can't shut up, to the people who think they know everything, to the people who are looking around and saying, I'm way out of my depth here. What I have found is that if we can, that when people start actually listening to each other, the rest of it seems to come together much more easily. And getting, and I don't ever say anything in meetings where we want to do consultation about don't let your ego get in the way or any of that stuff. What I try to do is say, well, we haven't heard from Bill lately. What's your thought on this? Mm-hmm. Or Sarah, what's your thought on this topic? And what I try to do, and with especially with my faculty, is this has been my experience with this particular issue. What is yours? Mm-hmm. Get people. Once you get people talking, and get other people listening, I also will. The only time I will interrupt someone is when they're interrupting someone else. Mm-hmm. Because again, it's the idea that you're not supposed to listen with the thought of how am I going to respond to this. You're supposed to listen.
Yeah.
And I honestly think the best consultations we've had, and one of the places, of course, that we do this is in our local spiritual assembly meetings. is when people actually are quiet after someone else speaks because they're actually trying to integrate what they've just heard.
Yeah. Your book describes what happens in a group or a team, whatever, when decisions are taken but then not implemented well. In the book you write, when we spend time in meetings arriving at decisions and making plans or recommendations only to see them either torpedoed, ignored, or poorly acted upon, we naturally feel, at the very least, disappointed, and with continued rejections, we often become depressed and withdraw from participating.
If the final step of the consultative process is really cuts to that. All of us, we created number 9, which is everything has to be supported. You cannot go out of the meeting and say, well, I didn't support that. We did that because we have seen, all of us had seen this happen. You go to a meeting, you have a long discussion, you make a decision, and somebody walks out, whether they're, a department head or a section head or something, and they don't like the decision, so they're not going to do anything about it.
Mm-hmm.
There has to be a complete commitment to give it a chance, because it's the easiest thing you can do with any decision is kill it by making certain that it doesn't get acted on or actively is roadblocked.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can prove that your position was right, and this goes back to ego too, but you can prove that your position is right by really sabotaging that decision instead of giving it a chance. If it's not the right decision, as we know, it'll become obvious very, very quickly. And we have the basis now to go back and look at what went wrong and fix it, or say the whole thing was wrong.
Yeah.
And start over. But that whole process, we have watched it. I have watched it, and I have to say that long before I was involved with the Baha'i faith or knew anything about consultation, I contributed to it.
Yeah.
I'm perfectly happy to admit that I've had my times when I'm not going to do that. That's ridiculous. Therefore, it failed.
Yeah. What other ways can we think of that we could kind of entice and interest or motivate people to think outside the box? Because when we see that there's conflict, there's not cooperation, decisions are not very well implemented, and we know that there's got to be a better way, how do we make that happen?
That is, I think, the crux of what we're looking at right now, how we make it happen. And part of it is going to be is by our actions and the way we interact with people. To me, there are so many clear examples of people that know what to do and just don't do it. We know, for instance, a lot about what we should be doing with respect to this current pandemic, but we're not doing it. And that's just one example. I can look at, I think that one way is when we start any decision-making process, we need to be aware of the principles of consultation. The first time that I did Unit 2 of Book 10, the consultation unit, there were a group of us that were assistants to our local ABM, and we all studied it together so that we could go out and present it to the community. And one of the people sat there, and when we got to Section 16, which basically lays out all of the principles, he looked at it and he said, I'm going to get a great big poster and laminate it, and every time I go into an LSA meeting, I'm going to put it on the wall to remind people what we're supposed to do. And I think that, because Baha'is are in many ways just as bad about this as everybody else. I mean, we don't understand it any more than anyone else. We have great intentions, but it's hard to remember how we're supposed to go about this. And so one of the ways is to talk about what the purpose is, what the outcome is supposed to be, and then make it very clear in any situation that first off we're going to take this seriously, this process of discussion and getting the ideas and keeping the tenor of the discussion very, very high. Put a high bar on that. We're not going to be yelling at each other. Yes, things will get heated. That's going to happen. But we also want to make sure that people understand that, Abdu'l-Baha tells us that from the clash of differing opinions, the truth emerges. And people have trouble with the word clash. They think of that as contentious. No, it's just a difference of opinion.
Yeah.
And so we need to have people understand that we can differ in our opinions, but we are looking for a consensus position that we will come to. And really remind people that when we walk out of any of these processes, that we expect full support from every member of the team, instead of people going out and saying, "Well, that was a stupid decision," and letting others know. One of the things we emphasize with our LSA all the time, even though I think it's probably not really necessary, but we remind ourselves that everything that happens is confidential, and that we walk out with, to use Shoghi Effendi's words, in serried ranks together. I think that we have to be careful how we get our business colleagues to do this, but I think if we can get them to understand that the object is to make decisions and then make them work.
Yeah. But certainly the mental framework that I grew up with is not the same mental framework that really we need to have in effective Baha'i consultation. I think everybody, whether they're from China or from the United States, I think everybody carries a lot of baggage from that culture that Shoghi Effendi defines as being impacting us. The environment in which we live, Shoghi Effendi's mentioned, I don't know the quote off the top of my head, impacts us. It cannot not impact us. And so getting around it, of course, is a real challenge, and this is what we want to try to think about in the course that we're teaching and to work on it.
We called it consultation early on, and then realized that was not going to work. And we aim it at a level that we hoped would get people to really pay attention first, and look at this rather than get caught up in semantics.
Yeah.
Sarah, again, you as a lifelong Baha'i, you've seen this all your life, and what we're finding is that with like our daughters and the friends of our friends' children who have been Baha'is all their lives and been exposed to this, are much more able to try and implement it. They too have the influence of the wider society, but I watch some of these kids and I think, God, I wish I was that smart at that age.
Again, Mike, thank you very much for the time you've spent with us. I think it will be very helpful to all the participants in the course. It's helpful to us, and it's really great that we could come together. And thank you, and we'll be in touch.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and it was a pleasure to finally meet you guys.
Great. Okay. Bye now then.
Good.
Bye now.
Bye.